Well, welcome back to this series on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the last couple of videos, we explored the discovery of these scrolls about 70 years ago along the Dead Sea, as well as overviewed their contents, the books, the writings that they contain. In our last video, we looked into the community that probably produced and used these scrolls, that of Qumran, and discussed a little bit about what other contemporary historians said about them, and what we could learn about them from the archaeology as well as from the documents themselves. And if you want to learn about those topics, there's links to both of those videos in the descriptions below. Please feel free to check them out. But in this video, we're going to be looking at the really important question about these documents overall, and what's of importance for many people today is, so what do these Dead Sea Scrolls mean for the Bible? What does their discovery and their contents reveal to us about the scriptures? This is, of course, the great interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls by the general public, and this is going to be the topic of this video today. The Dead Sea Scrolls is comprised of roughly 1,000 ancient documents. About 40% of these are copies of biblical books. There are multiple copies of some of these books. There's a dozen copies of the book of Isaiah, of Deuteronomy. There's also many copies of Daniel, of the Psalms, of Genesis. And while they range from scraps of books to large portions of these books, the most important is the Great Isaiah Scroll. This scroll is the entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, and it's important to us in that it's our oldest Hebrew copy of this book by over 1,000 years. It's incredibly ancient by our standards of Hebrew texts, and it says some very important things about the nature and the veracity of the scriptures themselves. Before getting into it, however, we should say a few words about the Old Testament itself, how it came into being and how it's been passed on down to us today. The Old Testament was largely written by Hebrew prophets. Inspired by God, they had various messages to bring to the people of Israel. And it has since been copied by scribes, and this was passed down century after century until between the 6th and the 10th centuries, a group called the Masoretes produced what was called the Masoretic text. This was a standardized version of these Old Testament documents, and what they tried to do was find the most reliable and ancient copies of the text available to them. The oldest Masoretic texts, as we call them, occur in the 10th and 11th centuries, and many more standard Hebrew manuscripts have come to us since that time. But many of the older and original manuscripts or the earlier copies of these documents were since discarded after being roughly standardized in the 6th through 10th centuries. However, there have also been independent traditions. The Septuagint was a Greek copy of the Hebrew text created in the 2nd and 3rd century BC, and that has its own tradition, which was later incorporated into Greek Bibles. There are likewise, a Latin translation of the Old Testament. There were translations in Syriac and Coptic and Aramaic and in other languages. And each of these were produced and stewarded and copied largely independently of one another by different peoples at different times for different uses. And these independent traditions of the Old Testament help us to corroborate the central message of it. As interestingly, despite the disparate communities that translated and copied and used them, there is remarkable harmony, between the texts. I mean, it's essentially the same text. And so it gives a great deal of confidence that the Old Testament text we have is indeed reliable and ancient. What's noteworthy of the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, however, is that they are Hebrew texts. As noted, after the Masoretes completed their standardization of the Hebrew text later on in the first millennia AD, many of these older manuscripts that were no longer needed were, in all likelihood, either discarded or replaced by these newer, more or less official texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls are from 1,000 years before the next oldest complete Hebrew manuscript that we have. And so it teaches us a great deal about this Hebrew tradition of the Old Testament scriptures. While there are scraps of many books, the Great Scroll of Isaiah gives us the greatest insight into this Hebrew Old Testament. And perhaps its greatest value is in comparing its content with the Old Testaments that we use in our own lives today. This great Isaiah scroll is noteworthy in a few ways in that it seems to have been fairly well used. It's rather worn. Nonetheless, its writing is remarkably clear, and the ink has been very well preserved in this document. The contents, however, are not as great, as there are a number of scribal errors contained therein. There are spelling errors, there are omissions of a few words or even passages. There are repetitions and so forth, fairly typical scribal errors. And also there are some blank spots that had been left and then filled in later by the scribe, as if the manuscript that they were copying from had some deficiencies in the text, or it was uncertain what the text was saying or something. Interesting also, there are corrections and additions on the scroll. Some are made in the scribe's own hand, where corrections are made above it, as we see here, or down along the margin. And other corrections appear to be made in another hand, perhaps at a later time. But while this text has not been perfectly copied, it is very noteworthy that the entirety of the book is contained, all 66 chapters, all in the proper order that we use them today, and the message is almost indistinguishable from what we use every day. There are roughly a dozen points in this great Isaiah scroll, however, that vary in some substance and that give us some greater insight into our Old Testament text. For example, the Revised Standard Version of Isaiah 60:19 reads, "The sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give light to you." The great Isaiah scroll text, however, adds the words "by night." While in itself not a major insight, as the moon usually shines at night, it does add a little parallelism to the text. Another example of this kind is Isaiah 45:2, where the traditional text reads, "I will go before you and level the rough places." In the Dead Sea Scroll, however, this reads, "I will go before you and level the mountains." Again, almost indistinguishable between the two texts. A third such example is found in Isaiah 56:12, where the traditional text reads, "Come, they say, let me get wine. Let us fill ourselves with strong drink." While the Dead Sea Scroll text reads, "Come, they say, let us get wine. Let us fill ourselves with strong drink." This is an interesting but also intuitive correction, as the number of the verb harmonizes in this case. And another interesting difference is in Isaiah 14:4, where the traditional text reads, "How the oppressor has ceased, the golden city has ceased," while in the Dead Sea Scrolls it reads, "How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury has ceased." This is perhaps a useful correction, however, as the golden city in the traditional rendering doesn't in itself make much sense. And this was translated from a word found in Isaiah of which the meaning was uncertain and which was guessed at from the consonants found in the word. However, the inclusion of insolent fury in the Dead Sea Scrolls text gives a better rendering of the text and perhaps was a synonym of what was used by Isaiah and gives a more accurate rendering, actually, of the text itself. These are some instances of the significant differences between the Great Scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic official version of Isaiah. Given that there are roughly 37,000 English words in the translation of Isaiah, the variance is quite small. And translating the Dead Sea Scroll copy of Isaiah into English would render us an basically indistinguishable version of this book from what we usually use in our scriptures. While these small number of variances give us a little bit of insight into what was intended by Isaiah, the real value of these Dead Sea Scrolls and this great Isaiah scroll in particular is a confirmation of the antiquity and the authenticity of the Masoretic tradition. That is, it confirms the reliability of the Old Testament that has been used for many centuries by the Jewish peoples and by the Christian church. And so, given the ancientness of these Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts and their large correspondence with what we use today, it gives us greater material confidence that the Old Testament that we use has been reliably preserved and passed down to us. This is also important, however, for Christians, as Isaiah is one of the books of the Old Testament that contains the most vivid prophecies of Christ. The Psalms, Genesis, Jeremiah, and others include many prophecies through the scriptures of what the Messiah will be like. But Isaiah contains such passages as, "He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. And unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." These prophecies are important in detailing our understanding of who Christ is, and especially regarding his atonement for us. And the antiquity of this great scroll of Isaiah, being composed roughly 200 to 300 years before Christ himself, gives confidence that these prophecies were standard and widely accepted long before Jesus himself came and walked on earth. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls are a wide variety of these biblical manuscripts, and they are profitable to review. In the description below is a couple links to sources for these documents, and there are also books that go into further detail on many of these questions. And it's both fascinating and well worth the inquiry. However, the overall impression given from these biblical scrolls within the Dead Sea Scrolls are that the Masoretic tradition of the Old Testament is indeed both ancient and reliable. Thank you for joining with us in this third video in our series on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in our next and final video, we'll be looking at some other ways that this discovery enhances our understanding of the past, of Jewish practice, of language, of textual criticism, and we will also take up the question of new finds. Just this last week, it was announced in the news that additional texts have been found near the Dead Sea. We'll look into this finding as well and explore what this reveals to us about this library of ancient documents and this community at Qumran. So thank you for joining with us today, and may God richly bless you.